Hello from the Napa Valley. I'm happy to talk to you today, even if we have to do this via technology instead of in real life. Oh, Cinta, I've just lost the screen again.
Yes, I'm trying to switch it on again, sorry. Now it's working, Paul, sorry for that.
Okay, I'll just start again.
Yeah.
Hello from the Napa Valley. I'm delighted to be speaking to you and hope to be a part of your program as you go forward. But it's sad that I have to do this through technology instead of in real life. I always love coming to Tarragona and speaking to you, but I do want to extend and offer to you to stay in contact with me. If you have questions, if you'd like input, please send me these things via email, and your team there has my contact information. I am a part of this program and I want to be helpful if I can. So next slide, Cinta. Because what we're talking about today is how we rebrand the future. Next slide. There we go. And one of the real challenges we have is if you don't already have a clear plan, deciding to rebrand is actually a mistake. So before you decide we have to do something new, you first have to understand what is it you are doing right now and what is it that isn't working. Many organizations do not have a clear mission statement. If you don't have a clear mission statement, don't spend money and time on rebranding. Establish who you are to begin with. Do you have a clearly articulated business plan? Do you know where your customers are and how you are going to attract them? And do you have ways of measuring your success? By the time if you have to depend on making money in order to measure your success, it's too late. So you need some intermediate steps. Is your database big enough? Is your outreach large enough? Those sorts of things need to be answered in advance so that you don't spend a lot of money going down the wrong path. And ultimately, have you done the research, both in terms of your internal resources and your external audiences, to really understand that your plan is going to work or is not going to work? Next slide. So the first question is, why do you need to change? I frequently meet with people or organizations who say we need to start again. And I want to know, why do you think it's not working now? Is there a problem with your product? Because if there's a problem with your product, rebranding isn't going to change that. It's simply going to put different words and ultimately a more confusing message around a product that has a flaw. If you're not reaching your plan, is it because your plan is unrealistic? You need to look at that very carefully. Is your positioning incorrect? How are you different from your competitors, and are you clear about that? If you haven't answered those questions, to then start a large campaign to explain, to reach out to an audience, it's just a waste of money. And to me, the biggest question of all is your execution actually good? Also, all too often what I discover is my clients tell me, well, we have a pretty good product. We were probably a little too overly optimistic in terms of our current plan. Our positioning isn't really very good, and we ultimately didn't do half of our marketing plan, so we need to rebrand. And my answer to them would be, first go back and fix all of these previous problems before you decide you need to rebrand entirely. Next slide. And so ultimately you have to do a brutal self-evaluation. Look at the mirror and really look at every wrinkle in your face and decide, is your product really good enough? Do you have clear positioning? And did you execute the current plan successfully? Why did that? Why did you think it was successfully executed, or why did it fail? And you need to look both at external factors and internal factors. That gives you the idea that gives you a way to evaluate whether or not you need to rebrand or simply do a better job of your existing plan. Next. So, of course, there are some easy ways to tell when it's not working. One of them is you're not meeting your sales projections. Okay, good. But for example, during the pandemic, if you're not meeting your sales projections, it's probably not only because your marketing isn't successful. There were external factors there. If you're not making your projected profits, this, of course, is fatal. But why aren't you making your projected profits? And what can you do to change that? Can you reduce operating costs in order to achieve those goals? And one of my favorite sayings comes from American baseball, and it says, it's better to be lucky than good. And one of the big challenges in business is sometimes you're lucky instead of being good, and you think you're good. And so you think you've done everything brilliantly because you've been successful. And then when things go wrong, you discover you weren't good. You were just lucky. And you need to know the difference between those two things. And ultimately, it's not working when what you have is not enough, or in the most important areas, your trends are moving in the wrong direction. Next slide. And this is the question I think is really important. I think every business needs to think about this. The one question you should always ask, instead of saying only we need to rebrand, the other question is, maybe we should just close the doors. And I think this is a very, very valuable question to ask at every step of the process. It's like being in a relationship. The question is, am I happier in the relationship or out of the relationship? Am I successful in the business, or is it time to pull the plug, turn off the lights, and go home because this isn't working? There's an old saying in rock climbing that you should never climb up something until you know how you're going to get down. And no investment is forever. I started my own company, but in the end, I knew there had to be an exit plan. You need to have an exit plan in place, and you need to understand when it's time to start that plan. And again, you need to be brutally honest. And you need to do this not only in times of crisis, but you need to do this. I would suggest that it's a good idea to do this every 3 to 6 months, to simply look at everything in the business and say, is it working? Or should we pull the plug? Next slide. Okay, you've done all of that. You've taken all of my advice. If you do that, you will be the first client in history that has taken all of my advice, but still, you've taken all my advice, and now it's time to change. You agree. So what's going to happen? First of all, with change comes risk, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. On the other hand, with risk comes reward, and we need to be very clear as we move forward. What are the risks and what are the rewards? How do we minimize the risks? How do we maximize the rewards? And then ultimately, is that combination worth it, or are there other ways to achieve the same goals? Next slide. So when we talk about risk, the first thing you need to understand is that your current customers must be protected as you change. One of the biggest challenges in any rebranding is the fear that you will take your current customers and turn them away from you. And if you do that, you will take an immediate hit to your business, and it's very difficult to get that back. And it's not just the fact that they buy your product. They buy it because they believe in you. I refuse to accept the concept that customers are simply sources of income. Customers are brand ambassadors. Someone who buys your product buys it because it's part of their life, and they tell people about it to your benefit. If you turn those people away, you've not only lost business, but you've lost a team of ambassadors that support your brand. So you need to be very careful to try to protect them at all costs. The second area then is you need to look for new niches, but niches that are based in trends and not fads. The difference between a trend and a fad goes up and down without any obvious reason. A trend is based on demographic change in the society. So there are some clear trends because of the pandemic. People are eating in restaurants less. They're buying wine in stores and bringing it home. So a trend would be to focus more of our efforts in retail rather than restaurant. Trends are important. Fads are lucky, not good. Don't focus on lucky, not good. Focus on trends. Build in an area, in a niche that you can actually not only identify, but own for the future. And look at ways that you can dominate those niches. Look at ways you can take a small niche and turn that into a core of passionate, enthusiastic brand ambassadors rather than just some customers. And of course, the thing you have to remember is you are not doing this in a vacuum. You have competitors, and competitors will protect themselves. They will attack back. They will try to defend themselves. And if you are struggling and your competitors are not, when you decide to rebrand, they are frequently in a better position to fight with you than you are. So you have to be extremely clear on what the risks are. Next slide. But I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to keep it anonymous because it's still we're still in process with this client. But here's a case study that they decided it was time to rebrand. And they came to me and they said, Paul, we want you to organize a strategy for rebranding. And I laid out some very clear steps for them. And the first one was, before we rebrand, we need to find out where you are now. Because rebranding is ultimately changing one position for another. If you don't know where the first position is, you don't know what direction to move to get to the second position. So research to find out where you are now. Then an analysis of the portfolio to establish what you have to lose in terms of risk and also some opportunities for gain. And then we develop the new strategies, the new messaging, and execute on all the levels. Next slide. So the first thing we wanted to do was establish, where are we now? And we wanted to measure awareness. So we did some very, very careful research here. We contacted about 50 key influencers in the American market. This was a project for the United States. And you can see on the right there, we took top distributors, retailers, restaurateurs, et cetera. We selected key members of those, the most important members of that audience. And then we contacted them and did an interview. And we didn't start off, and let's, for example, say that the client was the Napa Valley. It was not the Napa Valley, but let's say it was. We did not immediately contact them and say, what do you know about the Napa Valley? Because that immediately brings unprompted reactions that we don't want. What we wanted to know was, what do you think the most important wine regions in the world are? And when they said Bordeaux, Champagne, Rioja, and Napa Valley, we said, good, we're in that mix. If they didn't mention the Napa Valley, that would be a different challenge. And so the first thing we wanted to do was a series of questions that gave them no idea, completely blank slate. What do they think are the regions that have potential? What are the regions that they would like to know more about? What are the regions that they in the future see as being part of a new movement in the wine industry? And we were happy to see that the region we were talking about frequently appeared in their answers. If it had not appeared, then we would have had a very different kind of marketing communications problem, and a problem creating awareness rather than educating and promoting. So then we wanted to know, okay, second level of research was, what do you know about us? Have you tasted the wines? Have you visited the region? Have you attended a seminar on the region? Have you read a book about the region? Have you talked to someone who has been to the region? All getting a sense of what they know, so that, again, we're trying to build a structure of, here's where we are, now how do we go from there? We asked them if they knew the most famous grape varieties from the region. We asked them how many wines they had tasted from the region. All of this is an idea of, where are we starting, so that then we can build a plan for the future. Next slide. So we asked them current knowledge. Did you attend a seminar? Have you tasted the wines? Have you visited the region? Have you studied the region? Do you teach, or have you sold wines from the region? And then we want to click on all of these as, are you willing to give seminars, attend tastings, do visits, serve as ambassadors? We want to know all of those things. This gives us the foundation to build our program. Next slide. Okay, so what do they think? This is one of the most difficult things for wineries, but also wine regions, is, what do people really think about us? Because we only know what they tell us. And what they tell us is they love us because we're giving them free wine. We meet them at a wine tasting, they taste the wine, oh, it's delicious, thank you very much, I love your wines, thank you very much. We go back home and we say, everybody loves our wines. And in fact, the only people who love our wines are people that we give free wine to. That's not a marketing plan. So we have to do a much deeper dive, and we ask the people who didn't go to the tasting, why weren't you at the tasting? We have to go to the people who didn't taste our wines. Why didn't you taste our wines? We have to do all of these elements to really understand what the market thinks, to do a SWOT analysis. Where are we truly strong in the market? And again, my biggest concern about using a SWOT analysis in any marketing campaign is that people tend to say what we do well is a strength, and that is incorrect. A strength is something we do better than our competition. Every wine region in the world says we make wonderful wines. Delete that. That is not a strength, because right now in the world today, everybody makes wonderful wines. The question is, what do you do better than the competition? And you need to be very strict about understanding this. And then I would draw your attention to the last item there. Where can we improve? And it's always difficult for a wine region to look at this, but you have to ask this question. Where can we internally improve? Not where can we organize an advertising campaign that will solve all our problems, but in fact, where can we improve? When I am in Priorat, one of the questions they have in Priorat is, how can we create more hotels? Because if we have no place for people to stay, we can never really be a big destination for wine tourism. There's no place people can sleep. Next slide. And then you start looking at your portfolio. Now that you understand a little bit about what the customer thinks, now we need to look at the items in our portfolio. And I hope you understand these terms, but a cash cow, a reliable product that sells regularly and generates positive income without a lot of management from the company. These are critical products, and you need to protect them even when you're changing your branding and everything else. You need to protect your cash cows. Dogs are products that are not doing well, and we frankly don't have a way to solve that problem. And the solution to that is you need to get rid of your dogs. Stars are wines, stars are destinations, stars are resources that if Michelin, they were in a Michelin guide, they would get those stars. These are worth a special trip. And It's not every region has a star, but if you have a star, one really good strategy is to really promote that star as if it's the locomotive on a train. You start with the locomotive, the star gets the attention, you spend a lot of money promoting the star, but that star ultimately pulls a number of cars behind it that are the primary cash cows, the business of the long-term business plan. And then problem children, we all know what problem children are. They're dogs that have potential. So these are products that are not doing well, but could do well if we solved our problem with them. And so that's a particularly difficult, critical risk-reward analysis. And the difference between a problem child and a dog often is not in the product itself, but in how much money you have. If you have the money and time to devote to problem children, maybe you can make them stars. But if you don't have that time, maybe you just decide this is something we should leave behind. So the question is, where should you spend your money? Where do you need to spend some money? And the answer is you need to protect the cash cows. You need to promote the stars. Those are the two first strategies. And then the other products, dogs, you absolutely need to be brutal and say, we cannot afford to have bad products in our portfolio, and you need to get rid of them. Even if there's a small market for them, doesn't matter. Next slide. And here we get back to one of my favorite topics in the world of wine in general, which is what makes you so special, or as my mother always used to ask me, what makes you think you're so special? You need a compelling message. And the problem is that most wine regions and most wineries talk about soil, climate, viticulture, enology, organoleptic analysis. None of this reaches the emotional center of the consumer. On the other hand, if you talk about people, if you talk about culture, history, vision, and dreams, that's a way to reach the hearts and minds of the consumers. And the goal of a marketing campaign is not to provide an intellectual argument in favor of your region. It's to provide a seduction. It's to provide an emotional connection that creates not just intellectual interest, but emotional enthusiasm for your region. And that's where we need to talk. You can't create emotional connections with conversations about titratable acidity, pH, soil, climate. Those don't create emotional connections. Emotional connections are people, history, culture, vision, dreams. Next. People don't care. In the world of wine, people don't care about most of what we talk about. No other industry in the world says we could sell more of our product if we educated our consumers. Apple is the most powerful brand in the world, and it doesn't educate its customers. It gives them the opportunity to have fun and express their personality. Apple doesn't sell, it inspires. We don't want customers, we want missionaries. We want brand ambassadors who will go out and make and present the case that our products have changed their lives. And if we do that, we will be successful. Next. So we know where we are. We have a current image. We have current messaging. We understand what our current wine quality is. Very important here. We have a database of personal connections that we can leverage, and we know how much credibility we have. Credibility is enormously important when you start to rebrand. And you can certainly get additional credibility by admitting what we've done in the past hasn't been perfect, and now we're going to aim for a much higher goal. That actually generates credibility with the market. But what we do need to define is not just where we want to be. We need to start with, here's our current image and here's our projected image. We need to understand not just where we want to be, but where we're starting so we can move that in the correct direction. and I can't stress this enough, too many attempts at rebranding simply say, well, we want to be that, without understanding the roots of the company and how you need to train the vine or the tree to grow in that direction, rather than you can't just pick up a company and move it to another location and say, there, we've rebranded. Next slide. You only get one chance at this, but credibility absolutely is an asset. And when you announce that you are rebranding, of course, the first question is, everyone asks, well, what went wrong? What's wrong with where you are now? You need an answer to this. You need to be honest. You need to be open. You need to establish that credibility and say, we haven't done things perfectly in the past, but now we're setting a new standard. And you only get a chance to do that. You don't get a chance to try something and it doesn't work, and then 2 years or 4 years or 6 years later you say, the last time we rebranded, we didn't really do it right. Now we're really going to do it right. And of course, when that happens, people say, that's what you said last time. A really good example of this is the cork industry, which for years struggled with an ability to admit that corks were in fact a consistency problem in the wine industry. And it took them probably 30 years to truly address the problems. And in the meantime, they announced every year or two, oh, we have a new solution that solves all the problems, and it didn't. And you see today, screw caps continue to grow in popularity. Corks still play an important role, no question. But if you wanted to do a case study on how to not establish credibility as an asset, that would be a really good one to start. So what you have to say, what you say has to be true. You have to deliver on your promises. Most important of all, your employees and your members have to believe in what you are saying. There is nothing worse than having 5 of the 14 members of the consortium say, we don't think this is a good idea. Because you remember, anytime you make a change like this, many people will expect you to fail, which means you need to work twice as hard. You need to be twice as good to convince them that you won't. Next slide. And one thing I will tell you right off the bat is that it will take you a lot longer than you think. The market studies we've done in the US market show that it takes 3 to 5 years for a message to begin to work its way through the system. Partly change is hard. Partly people always resist change because for them to accept change, they then have to admit that what went before was a mistake. And people find that hard to do. You will always get the early adopters, the people who want to be on the edge, who will say, oh, I tried this, it's new. But remember, they are early adopters. They will try you, it will be new, but in 6 months, somebody else will be new and they will move on. And some of your old friends who have always loved your original positioning, no matter how hard you tried to protect them, they will decide that you've changed. And now that you've changed, you can't possibly be as good as you were. So when you decide to do this, please understand it will take 3, 4, 5 years for these messages to begin to work their way through. Francis Ford Coppola, who knows a little bit about talking to people and establishing emotional connections and all the rest, don't know if you know the full story of his winery in the Napa Valley. But he began by buying a winery that was originally called Inglenook, but the brand Inglenook had been sold by a multinational corporation and was now making very inexpensive wines. He bought the original estate in the Napa Valley, completely brought it back to its very pure and very high quality roots, made spectacular wines, and then after a number of years, he was able to negotiate to buy the name Inglenook back to be part of the entire package that was the original estate. The fascinating thing is when he bought that name, he then decided that no Inglenook wine would be released for 2 or 3 years. He wanted it completely out of the market before he came back with his new vision of what Inglenook should be in the future. And it is only now, a few years after that, that you're beginning to see that change in the marketplace. So it takes a long time. Next question, and next slide. Yeah, and this is part of the challenge. There will always be problems. You know, the distributor who hasn't been happy, he will want the media to write about your wines before they invest in them. But the media won't write about the wines until they're in the market. So you've got the distributor saying, I won't buy until they write, and the media saying, I won't write until they buy. And somewhere in the middle, you've got to try to convince everybody that both things are going to happen at the same time. Restaurants want wines that are not in supermarkets. So if your goal is to increase sales and you want to expand into supermarkets, be aware that restaurants don't like those wines because people see the wines in the supermarket for €7 and then they go to the restaurant and they're on the list for €20 and they say, the restaurant is cheating me. So all of these factors make life a little more difficult. And in the end, what everybody wants is not what you have. If you had this, you wouldn't be rebranding. What everyone wants is wines that sell themselves, and everyone wants you to sell the wines for them rather than them going out and selling the wines. Next slide. Which is why I always say you cannot sell wines to a market. You can only sell wines in a market. As the contests always say, you must be present to win. You need to be committed to spend time, energy, money visiting the market, talking to the people, developing those human relationships that ultimately create success in the wine industry. You can't do this by having other people do it for you. You need to have your personality, your expression in the market. The most famous winemaker in the Napa Valley is Robert Mondavi. Little bit of information here. Robert Mondavi wasn't a winemaker. He hired winemakers to make wine in his winery. Robert Mondavi spent 280 days a year traveling around the US market talking to people about wine. He built his reputation not on his ability as a winemaker. He built his reputation on meeting people and establishing personal connections with the market. And that's why he's the most famous winemaker in America. Another example is for years, my agencies represented the Union de Grand Cru de Bordeaux. They come to the US every year and they do a series of really superb tastings, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, sometimes Miami, Las Vegas, Denver, Seattle. These are massive tastings, 100 chateaus, 1,000 members of the trade. But here's the thing that's really fascinating about those tastings. When the Bordelais leave Bordeaux to come to the US market, the wines have already been sold. So in fact, they are not coming to the US market to sell wine. The wine has already been sold through negociants, through distributors. It is somewhere in that pipeline. The reason they are coming to America is simply to establish those personal relationships, to build that human connection so that the wines sell through at the back end. But they've already been paid. They already have their money. And they do this because they understand that's how you build a brand. Next slide. So when you put the whole thing together, you need a plan for each one of those audiences on the left. Distributors, retailers, restaurateurs, educators, media, consumers, influencers. You need a specific plan, a tailored approach, but you also need to make sure that they are consistent with each other. You can't tell distributors one thing and the media something else, because in the end, that will come back as a crisis. And you need to then develop a communication avenue that executes on all of these possible strategies: advertising, events, public relations, social media. You have to have a consistent message. It has to reach all of those audiences, and you have to use all of these various resources in order to achieve that goal. Next slide. So as a way of suggesting these, you need to have a consistent distributor presentation. You need to understand what is market support. Do you do winemaker dinners in restaurants? Do you travel do the trade tastings? Do you organize educational seminars? All of those elements need to be in place. You need to have a calendar to explain when they're going to happen, how they're going to happen, and on the other side of things, you need metrics. When we do a distributor presentation, what is the expected outcome? What is the cost? What is the expected outcome? Each one of the elements on the left needs costs and outcomes so that you can then, after 6 months and a year, remember, this is a 3 to 5 year project at a minimum. You need to understand after the first set of activities have concluded, which have been most successful? Which do we need to improve in some way? Which give us the best bang for our buck? And which ones do we need to eliminate? This didn't work. We don't think we can make it work. It's a dog. We need to get rid of it. And which ones were spectacularly successful? How can we do 4 more of those? When the Union de Grand Cru de Bordeaux first started working with us, they did only 3 tastings. These years, now they are up to 6 or 7 different markets because they see how effective they are. They get a very good return on their investment. They're very satisfied with the results. And so the program to do that. That's how it works. Next. So in summary, it will be slow. It will be painful, but it is possible. And I would give you some examples of these are regions that have not been successful. Chile entered most markets in the world as the lowest cost alternative in the world of wine, came to the US market selling wines for $2 a bottle. And they have never, ever really escaped that that positioning that they make really cheap wine. And of course, in the world of wine, making cheap wine means that you have made bad wine. The fact is, Chile makes excellent wines, but the power in Chile is concentrated on major multinational corporations. And when they come to America to talk about how wonderful the wines are, it's generally not an individual. It's generally not a person who makes his or her own wine on his or her own family estate. They are commercial. They are not personal human relationships. They are corporate marketing activities, and it's why they will never succeed until they start bringing small producers who have personality, character, and real ability to create a human connection. Australia, the industry was decimated by yellowtail, which managed to capture a sense of what Australian wine is all about, again, at a very, very low price. And it literally took the quality pyramid of Australian wines with the inexpensive on the bottom and very expensive, very good at the top, and just compressed it into one flat pancake. Australia now is engaged in a massive new rebranding campaign to talk about the various regions of Australia, because they need to communicate that not all Australian wine is yellowtail. And South Africa, the biggest problem has been that the wines that they have exported have not been the best wines, and they haven't really focused on wine quality as much as they should. They are doing more of that. So in each case, these regions are now rethinking this, but it's one of the reasons they have not been successful. Next slide. But there are some examples of people who have been successful. Chianti Classico recognized 15 years ago that the wine quality that they were offering was not competitive in the world market, and they completely redesigned their DOCG regulations. They completely redesigned how they make the wine. They have created a whole new category of wines, and they have repositioned Chianti Classico not as, oh, that cheap wine from Italy, but rather a high quality wine that can compete with the very best. But they did it not by beginning with a repositioning. They did it by beginning with the regulations and how they made the wines to improve the product. Once they had a top-end product, they could then move ahead with a communications plan. We were part of that. New Zealand. New Zealand took a look at the world of wine and realized that what they were making in New Zealand had been protected since World War II by heavy tax laws. And they realized that if they were going to compete in the world market, their labor was very expensive. And there was no way that they could compete with Australia and Chile. If New Zealand has neighbors in the wine world, it's Chile and Australia. They couldn't compete on price. And so they began back in the 1980s to think about how they could move forward. And what they decided was a focus purely on quality. And New Zealand today has the highest average per bottle price of any country in the world. And they have readily admitted, if you want to buy inexpensive wine in New Zealand, it's probably going to come from Chile or Australia. But if you want to buy world-class wines, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, you should be very proud of the fact that our wines are sold into some of the most important markets in the world at some of the highest prices in the world. So New Zealand, very clear opportunity to say we are rebranding with almost no international image. So they started almost with a blank slate and clearly focused exclusively on extremely high quality. And then the last one is Lodi. Lodi was a source for many, many years of very inexpensive wine, grapes. Almost no wines had a Lodi appellation. And I apologize for anyone who speaks Italian. It's not Lodi, it's Lodi in California. But they hired an executive director and gave that executive director an interesting contract. They said, you will get a bonus for every new winery that starts in Lodi, and you will get a bonus for every wine produced in California that had a Lodi appellation on the label, because they clearly understood that the problem with Lodi wasn't that it didn't make good wines. The problem was that people didn't even know that Lodi existed other than as a source for inexpensive wines. And so there are now over 100 wineries in Lodi. There are hundreds of wines with the Lodi appellation, and they have become a real success story in the US market because they have taken pride in their region, put it on the bottle, started a winery, and created this image where people travel to Lodi, they meet the families who make these wines, and they now have all the pieces in place to be a key player in the US market. Next slide. So here's the wrap up. You need to know where you are now before you can decide where you want to go. And you also need to understand why you are where you are now. Is it because your branding was wrong, or is it simply because you executed the plan badly? And then you find out, or then you determine where it is you want to be. And remember, you should aim for something you can own, that gives you an edge on the competition, that is unique, that other people cannot steal from you. And then once you know where you are and where you want to go, then you can talk about how to get there. And you need to know if it's working. So you need to have measurement metrics built in to measure your progress along that path. The Lodi example is perfect. Every time a new winery opened, that was a metric that we're moving in the right direction. And here's the wonderful thing. You can be successful. Congratulations. If you are doing this correctly, you will take a look at where you have arrived with your new positioning, and then you need to reevaluate and start the problem or the program all over again. Where are you now? And where do you want to be? I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to chatting with you, not in person, but via the internet links in the future. And I look forward to hearing from you via email, telephone, text, and being part of your project here at Wintour. Thank you.